If you guys have ever heard of the slow-mo guys, you know that they love to do crazy cool things with colors in slow motion. Back in 2015, they filmed an episode where they took colored ink and injected it into water while filming in slow motion, and it produced some really awesome results. This got me thinking, can you achieve a similar effect with Blender? And you can. It looks really awesome too. Arguably, even better than their footage. To start, we can go ahead and open up a fresh instance of Blender. I'll be using Blender 2.79. We can go ahead and delete everything in our startup scene because we won't be needing any of it. So now that we have a fresh start, we're going to basically build a smoke simulation because we can replicate this fluid ink effect using a smoke simulation. To do this, I'm going to add a UV sphere. This is going to be our flow object. However, we're not going to do things in the traditional smoke simulation way. We're going to make it a little bit quicker. I'm going to click Objects in the lower left-hand corner. We're going to come up to Quick Effects and select Quick Smoke. This basically sets up our domain object, makes our sphere a flow object, and it also sets up the material for our smoke. This makes things just go a little bit quicker. I'm also going to scale our UV sphere down a bit. That way we have a bigger ratio between the scale of our UV sphere and our domain. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the UV sphere so it's completely inside of our domain object. And just like that, we've already got a basic smoke simulation set up. If we hit play down on our timeline, we can actually see the simulation come to life. Now, keep in mind this is very rough right now and it's actually unlit. So let's go ahead and add just a point light to our scene. This is just going to be a temporary light, but if we position it off to the side, we can see more details of the smoke. So now let's go ahead and set up some domain settings. We'll start by selecting our domain object, which is our empty cube around our UV sphere. The first setting we're going to be changing is the resolution. Resolution will allow us to change how many voxels are used to simulate our smoke. And for those of you who don't know what voxels are, they're basically 3D pixels. So by default, the resolution's set pretty low, so we're going to go ahead and ramp it up to about 80. Now, this will make your simulation run a lot slower. To counter this, what we're going to do is we're going to check the box that says Smoke Adaptive Domain. This option basically creates a separate domain object that only calculates areas where the smoke simulation is actually being simulated, so it doesn't need as much time or power to process. This should make simulations much quicker. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to change the border collisions option here to collide all. The previous setting basically allowed smoke to travel through the walls of our domain as if the domain were a small part of a much bigger room. Setting the border collisions to collide all restricts the smoke to just our domain, so when it runs into the side of our domain, it acts as though it's running into a solid wall, something that it can't pass through. Alright, so things are looking good enough to go ahead and test out our simulation once again. I'm going to scrub to frame 0 on my timeline, then I'm going to go ahead and press play, and you can see that our simulation is once again working. Odds are if you're running this on your computer, it will be a little bit slower than the previous simulation that we did because we have more resolution to calculate, but it shouldn't be too horrible. Now, if you're like me, you love detail, especially in simulations, and it's kind of hard to get detail in a smoke simulation without cranking the resolution up to something like up in the 200s, which is really CPU intensive. Fortunately, we have this great setting called Smoke High Resolution, which allows us to create high resolution smoke more or less using a subdivision sort of method. So we can go ahead and enable this in our domain settings over here. We have this menu that says Smoke High Resolution. If we check the box next to this, our high resolution smoke is enabled. If we open up the drop down, we do have a few settings in here. We have divisions and noise strength, and those are the two we're going to be focusing on in this tutorial. For now, we're just going to keep the divisions at 1, which just makes things a little bit smoother, and we're going to set the noise strength to 1. Basically what this noise strength does is it adds a little bit of a ripple and distortion to our actual smoke simulation to add some extra depth. Now, you can play with this setting if you want to get a little bit more creative freedom, but I found that for the scale we're working with, 1 really looks nice. Now, for some of you, it might be really hard to render the high resolution smoke in your viewport, So what you can do if you're having troubles with performance is uncheck the box that says show high resolution down here. This will basically show the low resolution smoke, so you can work with that in your viewport, and then when you render, it will automatically switch and render the high resolution. So don't think that you have to recheck this box to render. It will automatically render the high resolution smoke. It just shows low resolution in your viewport. So it looks like we're good to go ahead and test our simulation again. It should run even slower than last time, oh boy, but fortunately it shouldn't slow down too much more past here. This looks good to me, so let's go ahead and move on. Up next, we're going to change some settings with our flow object. So I'll select our UV sphere. So in our simulation, we want our ink or smoke simulation to fall downwards instead of floating up. And we can change this by changing the temperature difference over here to -1 instead of 1. Basically what the temperature difference option does is it changes the temperature of the smoke when it's emitted. The reason that the smoke rose in our previous simulation was because it had a higher density than the fluid surrounding it. This difference in density was caused by a difference in temperature and resulted in an upward buoyant force acting on our smoke, causing it to rise upward. By changing the temperature difference to -1, we're more or less making the fluid more dense than the surrounding fluids, causing it to sink instead of rise. Another thing we're going to do here is check the initial velocity box. And what this does is it causes the smoke to copy the velocity of our flow object. So if our flow object is moving to the right, the emitted smoke will have the same initial velocity as our flow object. What this allows us to do is actually animate our flow object to give our fluid simulation a dropping in effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the UV sphere above our domain, so it's not in the domain at all. Then I'm going to go to frame 0 and press I, then select location off of the list. This adds a location keyframe at frame 0. Next, we'll scrub 10 frames into the future, so we're at frame 10. I'm going to move our UV sphere down into our domain, press I again, and select location again to add another keyframe. Now you can see if I scrub back and forth between these two frames, our flow object moves back and forth because we have animated it. So let's go ahead and hit play and preview it now. You can see that the smoke enters and falls down just like we wanted it to, which is absolutely perfect. Additionally, it copies the initial velocity of our flow object, giving it a little extra oomph. So one thing that I'm noticing with this simulation that isn't quite accurate is the fact that fluid just keeps pumping out of our domain object. And while this is good for certain situations, it's really not good when we're just trying to simulate a single drop of fluid. We have to somehow stop the flow. And in order to do this, we need to change a setting called density. Specifically, we actually need to animate the density for our simulation. Fortunately, Blender allows us to do this. So I'm going to go to about where we have enough, what I think is enough smoke in our scene, which is right around frame 15, I think. So at frame 15, I'm going to come over here into our density setting. I'm going to right click it and select insert keyframe. And now we have a keyframe at frame 15 where the density equals 1. Then I'm going to go a little bit into the future. I'll go to about frame 20 and I'm going to set density to 0 here. Right click our density slider here and select insert keyframe as well. And now if we press play to preview it, you can see that at frame 15, our smoke simulation successfully stops producing smoke, which is absolutely perfect. Now, upon further review, you're going to have to play with this with your own simulation as well, especially if you use different settings than I did. But I'm going to move this around a bit because this seems to be a little bit early. It seems to be stopping a little bit early. So I'm going to go ahead and split my window here by moving my mouse over these 3 little lines in the lower left corner. I'm going to click and drag to the right and our window splits into 2. In the left window here, I'm going to go ahead and open up the dope sheet, which allows us to edit the position of keyframes in our animation. I'm going to select the 2 keyframes that are density keyframes. You can tell they're density keyframes because it says density over on the left over here. And I'm going to move them a little bit into the future. So I think I'm going to move these to 30 and 35 because I think that might be a little bit better and give us a little bit more smoke to work with in our simulation. So let's go ahead and hit play to preview again. And that looks to be significantly better. So I'm going to leave my density keyframes between 30 and 35. Alright, so one last thing that we need to do here before we can bake our simulation and start working on lighting and materials, and that's to set up the colors. Now, colors are a super exciting part of this because it goes from being a gray, blah smoke simulation to something with pizzazz and pop. So I like to choose two different colors that work really well together. In this case, I'm going to choose a very vibrant pink and a very vibrant blue. And the reason I'm choosing these two colors is because they work well together, and vibrant colors tend to look a lot better in smoke simulations. Now, you can use whatever colors you'd like. However, I'd strongly recommend you try and match colors together. That way they don't come out blending weird or looking goofy. We can change the color of our smoke over here in our flow settings. And I'm going to go to about frame 10, and we can also keyframe color, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a keyframe at frame 10 with a pink color. So I'll select our color option, select a nice vibrant pinkish, maybe a little bit of purple in their color. And then when we've got that, we can right click our little color thing here and select insert keyframe. Then I'm going to go a few frames into the future. I'm going to go to about frame 17 or 18, 17 in this case. And I'm going to go ahead and choose my second color, which is going to be a nice bluish color. And then I'll go ahead and right click that as well and insert a keyframe here. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit play to preview, and we can see our two colors in action. This makes it look so much more interesting. Before it was very boring working with gray, but now we've got some color in here and it's going to look great. If your colors aren't quite mixing in the way you expected or wanted them to, you can always edit the keyframes over in the dope sheet. You can either make them transition between the colors quicker or move the transition later or earlier depending on which color needs more prominence in your simulation. But there's plenty of things you can experiment with and try out with your simulation, and you can get nearly infinite results. Fortunately, mine seems to be mixing really well, which is very convenient because that almost never happens. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step of baking. So in order to bake our simulation, we first need to save our project. So I'm going to save mine to my desktop, and I'm just going to call it Fluid Drop. You can call it whatever you'd like and save it wherever. This is completely up to you. One thing that you should be aware of before choosing a location is that your disk should have at least 10 to 20 gigabytes of open space on it. Baking takes up a lot of memory, and it's saved in the same location as your Blender file is. So make sure you have plenty of disk space available, otherwise the baking won't be able to complete. Anyway, once you have a location selected, all we have to do is select our domain object, come down to the smoke cache section here, and we can set a start and end frame. And this is how long we want the simulation to be. For mine, I only want it to be about 100 frames, so I'm going to set the start frame to 1, which it already is, and set the end frame to 100 instead of 150. Now, we can go to frame 0 and click Bake. The amount of time that this will take to bake varies on your computer's specs, but it shouldn't take too terribly long. Once it's done, we can go ahead and start setting up some basic lighting. So let's start off by finding a good frame to work with. In this case, this one looks pretty good because it has nice shape and we can see a variety of colors. I'm also going to turn my dope sheet window into a separate 3D view window over here. Now in my right 3D view window, I'm going to enter rendered view by pressing Shift Z. And you can see that now we can see our smoke actually being rendered, and it doesn't look all too good. But we're going to make it look good with the magic of lighting. So for one, we're going to delete our point light. This was just temporary so we could see some definition while working with our smoke simulation in the viewport. Now we're getting into some real lighting. We'll kick things off by adding an area light to our scene. This area light will allow us to add a light that's kind of dispersed across a larger area. So we'll change the size up to something around 3 over here in the settings, and we'll change the strength to about 1000. I'm going to move this light above our domain object so it's completely clear of the smoke and it's just shining down on it. And you can see that it lights up our smoke relatively well. Now we're going to need one more light here, so I'm going to go into front orthographic view by pressing numpad 1, then numpad 5. I'm going to duplicate our light object up here by pressing Shift D. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis by pressing R, Y, and then typing in the number 90. And then I'm going to go ahead and move it outside of our domain object on the right over here. That way it shines in on our smoke simulation. Now the last lighting tool we're going to add is an empty, and while this may seem a little bit strange, you'll see what we're going to do with it here. So I'm going to add an empty sphere just because I like the sphere as an empty object and we don't confuse it with our domain object. I'm going to position this empty completely below the domain, and then I'm going to parent both of the lights to it. This allows us to rotate the empty, and by doing so, rotate the lights around our smoke simulation. And this is a really great way to manipulate lighting easily in Blender. And then real quick, we're also going to set the world color to black. That way we don't have any ambient lighting ruining the contrast that is provided by our lighting system. Now if we switch to render view, we should be able to see something that looks at least a little bit better. However, upon closer investigation, we can see some banding caused by the voxels of our smoke simulation, as well as some unsharp edges of our smoke simulation, which is not ideal. So let's go ahead and tweak the material to get rid of these. I'm going to change my 3D view window on the left into a node editor. I'm going to select our domain object here, and in our material setting over here, I'm going to add a color ramp node between our density attribute node and the multiply node. I'm going to take this black slider and move it up a little bit. The position is going to be roughly equal to somewhere around like 0.15. And then I'm going to take the white slider over here and position it around 0.35. That seems to look good. And that should work with just about any simulation you throw at it. The last thing we're going to do here is set the strength of the multiply node to about 4, and this will help us reduce banding because when it's set to 5, it has a lot of contrast in it, and when we set it to a lower value, the lower contrast makes it harder to see banding. Alright, so our material is looking good, our lighting is looking good enough for now, so let's go ahead and start working on some compositional elements with the camera. I'm going to change my left window here back into another 3D viewport, that way we have two different spaces to work in. Then I'm going to add a camera to our scene, and I'm immediately going to jump into camera view by pressing 0 on the numpad. Then, over here on the right, I'm going to change our render resolution to about 1000 by 1250. This gives a nice vertical aspect ratio that catches a lot of our fluid simulation. Now, to actually position the camera, what I'm going to do is press Shift and F, and that allows us to enter what I like to call like a video game camera mode, where you can move around using W, A, S, and D to go forward, left, right, and back, Q and E to go up and down, and then you can look around with the mouse. So it's a really nice way to position the camera. I'm going to position my camera right below the fluid simulation, or I guess not right below, but off to the side and a little bit below, just because it gives a cool, unusual angle that's very appealing to the eye. I'm also going to come up into our outliner and hide our sphere that we used before as our flow object. Hiding it won't affect its simulation qualities at all. It just makes it so it doesn't render. So I'm going to hide it both from the 3D viewport because we don't want to see it there, and I'm also going to hide it from the render because we don't want to render it at all because that kind of ruins the quality of the render. So in our render view window over here, I'm going to go ahead and enter camera view now by pressing 0 on the numpad, and I'm going to leave camera view in our other 3D viewport window because we're going to be editing things using this viewport. I'm going to select the empty, and I'm just going to kind of rotate the light around so we can light our smoke simulation accordingly. And I'm going to go for a little bit of side lighting here. So we have one light shining from the top and one light shining from the side of the camera. And basically what this does is it adds a nice contrast where one side is bright and one side is darker. It's not going to be completely dark. And it's a really nice style to work with. Another thing you could go for is backlighting it, which almost always turns out interesting. However, I do prefer side lighting. Now, at this point, I'd recommend toying with the lighting a bit more, maybe get something that looks a little bit better now that we have new materials. I'd strongly encourage you try to change the colors of the lights or try and change the positioning of the lights, so maybe they're not just from the top and from the side, maybe they're on an angle or something. Get creative, try something new, and it'll come out more unique than all the other renders. So after you figure out your lighting, we can go ahead and work on post-processing. So we'll do a test render at about 100 samples. I wouldn't recommend going too high above this because it's really just going to take extra time, and 100 samples is all you need to work with post-processing. So we'll do a quick render here, and it shouldn't take too terribly long. But once it's done, we can go ahead and open up the node editor once again in our separate window over here. And we can switch from our material editing mode to compositing mode. This compositing situation is another situation in which you will probably have to be a little bit creative on your own as well. For me, I'm going to add an RGB curves node, and I'm going to create this sort of S shape in our contrast menu here to give us a little more contrast, especially in the lows. So I'm actually going to add another handle here and drag it down, and we'll make a little dip right in here, and this will give us a lot of contrast down at the lows. And the idea is to just add a little bit more contrast, but not too much that it's just like clipping into darkness. That would be no good. Another thing I'm going to do is boost the blue and green colors in the shadows. So I'm going to come into our red tab and drop the reds down a little bit in our very low colors, and kind of create this shape as well. And again, you're gonna have to be a little bit creative here. If you guys don't know how to use the RGB curves editor, don't worry too much about compositing. It's not super important. It just adds some extra color grading and color effects to our scene to make it look just a tad bit better than it did before. Once you find a setting you're happy with, we're ready to do a final render. Now this next step is optional. You can do it if you'd like, but it's again, really not necessary. It just adds extra quality to your render. I always like to free my bake before I render, increase the high resolution divisions to 2, and then rebake. This adds a lot of extra detail to the smoke and makes it look a lot more realistic in my opinion. However, it's not entirely necessary that you do this. Once it's done rebaking, you're ready to render. You can render just about whatever you'd like, whether that be a single frame or the entire animation. I'd recommend using about 500 samples because volumetrics need a lot of samples to look really nice. Now, one thing to avoid with this is using the cycles denoiser. While it is a great feature, it struggles a lot with volumetrics and can give you some really weird artifacting. So I'd strongly recommend not using the denoiser and instead opting for the higher samples and the higher render times. It's a little bit unfortunate, but it's the best option you can get, and I don't want you guys spending hours rendering something that's going to come out all glitchy. Anyway, that about sums it up for this tutorial. I hope you guys learned something new, and I hope you go along to create your own fluid drop simulations. If you do, you should totally share it with me on Twitter or Instagram. I love seeing what you guys create. I've left my tags on the screen in case you want to. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Adios!